Welcome to CannaBiz Conversations. I am your host, Sean Welsh. I am today so blessed to have, I consider, the biggest name on the growing scene, at least in the nutrient scene, if you want to get technical. But for right now, I don't know anyone bigger or badder in the scene. I always joke on his post that it's kind of what I hope to do when I retire from my car business career. The plant geek himself, Damian Solomon. Damian, how are you, man?
Hello, I'm doing very good. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for agreeing to do it. You're a big time follow for me in the industry. Like I said, I like the way you do business. I like the way you travel. I think you're a great insight individual. You know, always kind of giving away that information as you go along. Never selling, always showing value. I'm a huge fan. So, give me an idea, man. How did you get into the cannabis space? Like, what's the origin story for you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've always been I've always been involved in cannabis in one way or another since an early age. I've always been, passionate about plants. I've been a plant geek ever since I was born. Um, and I kind of went the route of traditional agriculture, traditional horticulture, right? So I went to school for horticulture, and then I began my career in greenhouse vegetables, hydroponic greenhouse vegetables, but all the time still having that attachment or being connected to cannabis. And so I've always been a long time user. And so when I had the opportunity to get into the commercial space, like in late 2014, early 2015, I jumped at the chance, right? So I was visiting a facility up in Vancouver. It was one of the first license holders. I believe it was the actual first license holder in Canada. And they invited me to come have a look at their facility, kind of give them a few pointers, a little bit of feedback. And so by that time, I had built large scale, like high tech glass houses. I had worked on a couple of indoor vertical farms for leafy greens, that sort of stuff. And so when I walked into this facility, I was kind of blown away because they had touted it as a state of the art. It was going to be $30 million project, all the bells and whistles. So when I walk into this place, I quickly understand that none of that was happening, right? That it was just a larger version of somebody's basement. And, you know, um, as you go to commercial scale and as you're building a business, that type of design is just not going to work. So I quickly understood, hey, I have the skill set, I have the passion to be able to provide cannabis growers and farms and producers all around the world with just better knowledge, right? Better transfer of knowledge that from the horticulture space, and that was something that we hadn't seen because of where cannabis started from, right? It started in the shadows, right? It started in grandmother's basement. So growers didn't have access to kind of modern technologies, modern know-how. And so I really saw a need for being able to transition that into the commercial cannabis space.
Dude, that is so awesome. And I love that. I love the fact there's always that tie-in, right, with the vegetable side. So like when we started growing in Colorado under medical licenses back in the early 2000s, right? It was the same way, but when you went to the greenhouse, you still were like, yeah, I'm growing tomatoes. Like you still weren't able to be outright about how you were doing things, right? So it was always this joke about kind of having to keep in line with whatever we were doing. But your point about the size and scale of things, is that something that you are still running into right now as you go into operations and look where people think they can get away with that sort of exaggerated basement grow, and as reality they need, X?
Yes, and that's still something as each state kind of comes online because we're so fragmented with the cannabis industry within the United States that each state kind of has their own regulatory constraints behind it, their own policies behind it. So it really is kind of their own bubble and their own market. And so what you see happening is the further you get away from California, so the further east you go in the US, the further removed people are from just the industry and where the industry was, where it's going. So they tend to make the same mistakes, right? A lot of times the early movers will get a license. The group themselves or some type of an investment group, whether it be a group of doctors or a group of real estate guys, where they themselves, they dabbled in weed, they might smoke weed, but they themselves have never grown it. So they look to and partner with legacy operators, and legacy operators have done a great job because they've been able to sustain themselves over the years in a non-legal market. They were really the backbone of the industry, right? But they have their limitations because of that. And like I stated before, they don't have access to modern horticultural know-how. And so you see that problem, those mistakes still happen today, right? In fact, this morning I was talking with a potential client from New York who was dissatisfied with their performance of their current production system. And, when I got done talking to them, it was apparent that, that they are still making the same mistakes, right? And then you look at other regions like Europe, where Europe is a growing, it's an area that's going to be growing for the next 10, 15 years in terms of potential for medical cannabis. And you still see those problems happening there. So I would say that it's still a global problem. Just getting that access to competent knowledge, which will then help to bring better facility design, better efficiencies at play, and just build it like a business.
Yeah. Yeah, man. And that's what I love about following you, is that's the kind of stuff that you drop on people regularly, right? Is you're like, look, it's about the efficiencies. It's about doing more with what you already have. And that's why I think from your perspective, I'd like to hear this. Where do we, because you're worldwide, I like to say. So where does the US rank as far as, in your opinion, versus a European market in that ability to grow? And we can even compare it to Canada, like as far as who's winning the knowledge race right now? Who's ahead? Who's utilizing tech? Like, how do you feel that the weeds arm race is going kind of globally? Is a question I've been wanting to ask you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a two-part question, and I'll frame it in this way because I think California is the epicenter of cannabis at a global level, right? Because we were one of the first adopters of a medical program. There's a large underground scene here, a legacy scene, and everybody talks about Northern California, which is great. They grow some great cannabis, and so I think a lot of the legacy know-how, a lot of the genetics, a lot of the top name brands that are out there have all come out of California, right? But what I will say is that because of that, the first license holders, the very first operations that came out, in the 2013, 2010s and all that stuff was really duplicated on what they had done before. So you tend to see some facilities with less efficiency and still that non-licensed mindset, right? Yeah. So what that means is that technically, even though they have a long history with the plant and growing the plant, they didn't necessarily deploy the most modern technology. So where I see that kind of on the converse of that, or the flip side, is the European market and the way that they've structured it regulatorily through the regulatory framework is really requires the producers there to be growing a GACP certified and a GMP certified product. Now, what that means is by default, you need to have systems in place, you need to have infrastructure in place to support that. And by default, that's already going to put you at a much higher level in terms of the infrastructure and the support that you have to build it as a business. So, but what they lack is the general understanding of growing cannabis, right? So you have a Ferrari, no driver, and in the US, you have a driver and no Ferrari. So It's kind of a converse to each other. But what that means is you have opportunity to take what we learned in California and in the US and some of the early adopting states like Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and even in Canada, and now take the driver and place him with the car, with the Ferrari. So we're able to transfer the knowledge, we're able to transfer what we've learned in the US very quickly transfer it to what we see happening in Europe to help to ensure that they're successful as their market starts to take off.
With that regulatory oversight, the GACP, GMCP, how do you, like, you know, people, everyone, government get involved in growing weed, blah, blah, blah. Everyone's got a, you know, their own opinion about that. But like, are you in favor of people going down that road so that people are forced to modernize? Like, how do you view that part of regulatory oversight? Every new state that comes on board is changing regulatory, which I don't understand why you don't just mock a Colorado, mock a California, mock the most, you know, whatever's the most, you know, successful of the group. But how do you view that regulatory insight part?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think you can compare, say, how Europeans do things to how the US does things. What I find, what I find advantageous in Europe is that within the EU, if one country adopts something or one country allows something, then most of the EU will follow suit within that same framework. So they make very little changes to what's necessary in a different country. Like I mentioned earlier, here in the States, you have a basic framework that you can find some similarities in, but there are some vast differences between each state, right? You have some states that are limited licenses and that those licenses allow for vertical integration. You have other states that want to break up that integration so that you reduce the chance for monopolies and things like that, which I understand their aim and their desire behind it. A lot of times the implementation and the rollout is where the problems happen. But you have some states that, you know, that only allow you to own one or two licenses within the vertical. And so you have different structures in place, and it affects their business and affects your core business and how you do things, where you have a lot of regulatory constraints. Obviously, you have to follow a lot of processes. You have to have a lot of touch points. You have to have a lot of measurements and recording of that data. And so you create a system where the costs are a little bit higher per gram produced because you have all of these processes that you do have to follow, right? And so it's going to cost labor, it's going to cost infrastructure, it's going to cost time, it's going to cost money, and it's going to cost design. You need to make sure you're planning it to fall within that regulatory constraint. Whereas, you know, some places in the US, especially the early adopting states, you just had a program and there wasn't really anybody telling you how you needed to frame it, or, you know, even though you have testing requirements in each state to ensure that the end product is safe for consumers. Most of that is in a recreational setting. Most of Europe is in a medical setting. So you're going to have a couple of different layers in place just to ensure, that somebody who's using it medically and that may have a compromised immune system is not going to be affected by some contaminant, right? And so my initial thought is that there will be a loosening up of some of the requirements in the European Union when the recreational market really starts to take hold there, right? I think from a medical standpoint, yes, you should have as many requirements in a medical side, only because you are dealing with individuals who may have a compromised immune system. You don't want them to get more harm than good by consuming cannabis. So where in a recreational setting, you still want to make sure that the product is safe for human consumption. You never want to cause any type of, ill health or anything like that for your products. But at the same time, you're not limited, to a very specific set of regulations that tend to cost time and money at the end, right? So, yeah, I think we'll see the legal recreational market start to loosen up a little bit in Europe. Or at the same time, I think that as the US starts to become more professional, and as each state starts to learn the what worked and what didn't work from the prior states, that you're just going to have a natural evolution of the industry where some of those poor performers or bad actors that didn't want to follow regulations, there's going to be some natural attrition that kind of sloughs them off. So we kind of see that happening a little bit now, where we see like Cannabis 3.0 price compression comes down, and those operators who didn't necessarily build their farms or their production system with those efficiencies in mind, they're starting to not be able to have success when price compression's down because their cost of production is too high. So in the end, I think you'll start to the field will start to level off. It's just going to take, some maturation and some time.
Yeah, it's a couple of things I want to go back and ask you on that. So on the you were talking about the cost, right, of the European market versus here. Do you have a sense of like just at a basic level, like an ounce, what it would cost to grow an ounce? Not what it cost. I guess what it would cost to grow an ounce in Europe versus what it costs to grow an ounce in California.
Yeah, I mean, the wholesale, and we'll talk like bulk pricing. The bulk pricing, bulk pricing from like Portugal, right? Portugal's a very large cannabis producing region of the EU, and they're able to export to other legal countries around the world. So some of my customers who are based in Portugal are like selling into Australia, and they're selling it for, it depends on quality a little bit, but say anywhere between say $3 and $4 a gram is kind of where it's at right now. And that's bulk wholesale. Whereas in the US, bulk wholesale can range realistically from $1 a gram to $1 a gram to anywhere up to $2 to $3 a gram, something like that, on the bulk pricing. And then the more efficient growers in the US then can produce it for much lower cost. So they're still somewhat successful, right? Or they're at least not sinking. They're staying afloat with those prices. So that's really where you want to be in, right? And what I see in Europe happening is most of the early adopters there were greenhouses, but we see a shift away from greenhouses, and there are more and more growers now in Europe going into an indoor situation, just because they're able to find that they can keep a much higher consistency in their output, because of the seasonality of the sun. So that may drive the price of production up a little bit more, because now they don't have the benefit of having the sun as part of their light source.
Free power, as it were. Yeah, totally. I totally agree with that. Going back to this other one, it's a hot topic right now, man. Me and Dustin got into it a little bit on my first show. I got to ask you, because you sort of brought it up a little bit with the testing. Where does Damian stand on mold as it relates to cannabis? Like, is this high level concern? Is it always been there? Is it something that's always going to be there? Where do you stand, man?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what we've seen from kind of a plant perspective, we see that cannabis does have an issue with certain types of pathogens, right? Like powdery mildew, botrytis, things like that. And it's a challenge for growers. And saying that, I think that the regulatory bodies and the testing services need to have a test that can discern what is a beneficial microbe and what is a pathogenic microbe. And in some instances, the states will test all yeast and mold, and it's a little bit of an unfair test, because there are beneficial yeasts and there are beneficial fungi that help to protect the plant against the pathogenic organisms. So by being able to discern the species, then the regulatory body can say, okay, we found yeast and mold, however, they are of this species and they are of no concern to human health, right? Again, we don't ever want to create a product that's going to harm humans in any way. So we need to ensure that the final product is going to be free of these contaminants, but at the same time, make it fair and make it easier for the growers to be able to pass some of these tests, because it's kind of a skewed test, and it's not fair to say we're going to count all total yeast and mold, which includes beneficials, as part of your count, and now all of a sudden your yeast and mold colonies are higher than the legal limit, and then now that farmer has to do some remediation, has to do some other extra secondary processing to try and get it below that limit. So just
is it safe to say that you agree? I don't know. I don't want to speak for you, but
Yeah.
that remediation does change flavor profile, all of these things. Is that, I mean, with big story coming up Oregon here recently. I mean, where is that something you believe in?
Um, I mean, I think when you have to remediate it, it's a different situation, right? I'm always the kind of person that says, okay, if you know, you can put a band-aid on something, or you can try to fix the core problem. A lot of times through better processes, you know, just better operating procedures, or maybe just with the addition of some type of technology, you're able to create a situation where you can reduce or even totally omit the need for any of that stuff, right? Because you're able to produce a cleaner product through your internal processes, and now you don't have the need to do any type of remediation. But having said that, where we're at today, I know that there are farms that need that remediation, right? And I think that if you have to remediate your product, then you're trying to do it more of a fire sale to ensure that you can move product more than you are trying to say, okay, I'm trying to produce the highest product to maintain my brand equity. And therefore I need it to have a certain taste, a certain things, because we still don't know. I mean, I think that anytime you blast large amounts of energy at something, you're going to excite certain molecules. You can be a catalyst for a chemical reaction, right? So therefore, I don't think we know enough about how these high energy sources would change the chemical makeup of the terpenes, of the phenols, of the aromatics, of these secondary and tertiary compounds, right? Because they're all going to get excited by this energy, and then they can oxidize, or they can go out there and react with other things. And so I just don't know how to answer that yet. I think that the machines that people are using currently are most likely going to improve to reduce that. But I still hear conflicting results. But every time I ask them a question, would you prefer not to use it? It's like, yes, but they have to use it, right? So I think shifting again towards the processes, let's fix the problem early in the processes so we don't have to get to that point.
Yeah, I think that's my favorite takeaway of this whole mold discussion is, look, if you're doing it right, all the way through and through, this is probably not something that will come up as a part of your discussion. And I think a lot of people need to realize that, you know, again, having been a grower on a medical small scale, you know, 100 plant grow inside my own house with, you know, a couple friends helping out, I can tell you that those littlest things, what that must happen at a, you know, commercial scale, just the annoyingness of one room, you know, in my setup, I can't imagine that across commercials. So, but again, it does come back to process. And that's what my buddy who has helped me along the way, he's like, look, you missed up right here and here. This is why this happened. Like, you can't allow for this. And so you learn and you go through, and again, you can afford to make that on 100 plants. You cannot afford to make that on 100,000 plants. You know, you really want to make sure that you're dialed in. Again, I really like that part of the approach for you. So let me ask you, as you see kind of this whole thing working out state by state, do you, in your opinion, do you think it becomes federal before 50 states get up? Or, and if so, do you think they follow anything like a state does? What do you think the federal part does, besides easing the financial side of the industry, which we all agree is helpful in some way, as long as not being taken advantage of? But from an actual regulatory standpoint and looking at that, what does a federal change mean versus a state level to you?
Well, I mean, I think that it's going to, you know, I mean, it's good and bad, right? I mean, and we can sit here and talk about and discuss the good and the bad all day long. But I think what it's going to do ultimately for me, any system that is going to allow better access, better availability of high quality cannabis to consumers across the US, I'm all for that. Whether that's within an in-state distribution system, or it's within a national distribution model, right? If you look at traditionally, and it's starting to shift, but traditionally, when we look at like our food crop production, right, where we grow crops, we're growing crops in the breadbaskets portions of the US, and then we're distributing it through the other parts of the US. So what that means for is there's probably going to be a reduction in the need for having growers grow within a certain state. And now they're going to be able to import that product, say, from California or the Southwest, where we have favorable conditions year round. And then that's going to be then shipped into places in the Midwest and Northeast for year round production. So What that means is that you'll probably have a reduction in licenses or a reduction in farms producing it in New York, whereas there's going to be shipping it from California to New York, right? Again, that's part of the market. But I also still think that as you go to differentiate yourself against those products, there's always going to be a need for in-state or locally produced product, right? And typically that comes at a higher value point. So you're able to get a higher dollar per gram because it's grown in state, and people that have that buying power are willing to pay an extra dollar or two because they say, I want to support local. I trust where it comes from. I can look out down the street and see the grower. I know the grower. So there's a higher level of confidence of the product that you're consuming and putting in your body is going to be safe, right? And so it can be used to differentiate your product, or it can be used to help streamline distribution across. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, again, we can sit here all day.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I always promote locally grown or local products. I don't drink alcohol anymore, but when I was a big beer drinker, and I always had my staple beers that I drink at home. But when I would travel, and you knew how much I travel, I would always make sure that if I'm drinking a beer somewhere, it was a local beer, right? Or even if I went to a dispensary, I wanted to try a local product. And so it's always good to have that because people's passions are different, people's understandings are different, and you're going to have a slight difference in the quality and the experience of that final product. Versus if everybody was getting it for the whole U.S. from the same farm in Southern California, then the experience that they're going to see is all the same. And sometimes with a product, with cannabis, it means so many different things to so many people. It allows you to kind of connect with the plant, knowing that it was grown, down the street. So, yeah, I mean, there's a good pros and cons, and I'm kind of torn either way, but I see the benefits of each system.
Yeah, I'll say again, the highlight for me there is better access. And I agree. I think it should be as accessible as possible to everyone and anyone over the age of whatever we all decide is fair, whether it's the age to smoke a cigarette or the age to drink a beer. I don't really care. The point is making it safe and legal is really for me the most important thing. Again, you talk about the local part of it, and I mean, I'm here in Wisconsin, right? So middle of the Midwest. And farmers markets are humongous. They're in every city there. And so to me, that sort of translates to me. Granted, my state is in some weird mood of prohibition forever as it relates to cannabis, even though it's not on an island. But the point is that it proves that local economy, because of how busy these farmers markets are throughout the entire year. The one in Madison now goes into a winter one. It's packed. I mean, it's insane. So, people are here for it. When you see sort of, that evolution of parts, like, do you ever do any sort of like consulting still in the horticultural space, or are you just mainly in cannabis? I ask because we always have so many different, horticultural things going on here in Wisconsin. So is that still a part of what you get to do with your life, or is cannabis the full-time gig?
No. By all means, I still work in other crops, mainly vegetables. And so one of the things that, and I had spoke earlier, and I said it's kind of shifting and changing. So if you kind of look at how produce was grown and distributed throughout the U.S., it predominantly was grown, the Central Valley of California, Arizona, SoCal, all these places, and then just shipped everywhere. Like the lettuce is just shipped everywhere. But we see a shift now in the last, say, 10, 15 years of more and more local farms popping up and large commercial farms, right? So the idea is instead of shipping, 1,500 miles across the country, now you're able to build a facility that's near an urban area, and then you're able to produce locally grown product that services that urban area. And so we see an increase of localized food production systems. And I think, with the pandemic, that just accelerated the need for it. And it's not even in the US. You see that globally, that there is a movement for food independence Inflation is high, so they want to be able to produce food locally to reduce that cost. And then also start to, empower the local people with new trade, like getting them jobs, creating a situation where you're bettering people through better products and a better life, is always going to be a positive thing. And we see that same shift happening, like with cannabis. It's better to like farmers markets, like you mentioned that. Like I know that New York is going to start allowing cannabis farmers to sell at farmers markets. And so when you look at how people buy, like their buying trends and their consumer trends with produce, it almost follows suit to how they're going to buy it for cannabis, because it's something that they're putting in their body. So they're going to want to follow the same trends. And so if people are already buying tomatoes, buying their eggs, buying their lettuce and their fruit at a farmer's market, they're going to connect with the growers who are providing them with their cannabis. It's
total natural connection. I mean, if there's enough for three honey guys and 3 soap guys, there's certainly enough room.